welcome to the Education 2711 interview series. I'm Patrick O'Leary.
And I'm Chris Parsons.
And today we're joined by expert Dr. Jonas Hallström. Dr. Hallström is a professor of technology at Linköping University, Sweden, where he also earned his PhD. He holds a Master's of Arts in English Literature. His research interests primarily relate to the historical emergence of technology as knowledge content in school, the epistemology of subject philosophy and technology, various content, as well as attitudes to and knowledge of technology and technology education of students and teachers. His research also relates to technology teaching in relation to design, gender, authentic learning, models and modeling, and STEM education. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Hallström.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start off, the first question we wanted to ask is, what is technological determinism, and why is it such a central question in the history and philosophy of technology?
The notion of technological determinism has to do with what it means is that technology kind of, in some sense, determines societal development and also human behavior at the micro level. And what I write about is also the twin notion of autonomous technology, and that's actually one step further, where you also have technology that is in some way autonomous in relation to society and develops of its own capacity, so to speak. And it is a really central issue in the history and philosophy and sociology of technology, I would say. To what extent is technology a force of its own, and to what extent is it controlled by humans? And it's particularly pertinent since it's, technology is a human-designed feature. That's something that we as humans have created. So it would be very ultimately dangerous if we don't have control of our own creation, so to speak. And it was first developed in literature, for instance, in Mary Wollstonecraft's Frankenstein's monster, which was a technologically created monster that got a will of its own. And then after that, throughout history, this has been a concern that's been very pertinent, especially in the history of technology, philosophy, sociology of technology, and even more today, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you hinted at it a bit there in your answer, but could you speak a bit about what is actually at stake in the debates around technological determinism? I think in some ways it can be or feel sort of like abstract, but like why does it actually at the end of the day matter whether or not sort of technology is a driver of society, or whether it's or whether it's not, or to what degree it is?
Yeah, as I write about in the article, there are maybe two answers to this. One is the kind of empirical aspect of it. Can we find in history and in present day society evidence of technology actually determining what we're doing? And I would say that there are, situations, and those are the situations I call deterministic potentialities in the paper. There are situations where actually technology kind of determines, in a sense, what we do. For instance, from my own research, where I've studied sewer systems, the fact that sewers are widespread and they are very expensive and they're in the ground, it makes them kind of determine what the other choices that we can do, choices we can do about wastewater services are, in a sense, determined by what's in the ground, so to speak. But then, on the other hand, we have they're also the result of human choices. So, of course, we can change them, but there is some determinism there, certainly. Then we have the idea of determinism, which is also pertinent, I think, since it in certain theories you presume that technology is determining what we do, and you can find it in the writings of Heidegger, for instance, and Jacques Ellul, that think of technology in terms of a very determining structure in society, and why that's important to deconstruct, to criticize, is that if you think that technology can't be changed, then it's very dangerous, I think, from a democratic point of view.
Awesome. Why is it important for technology educators to think about technological determinism in our careers?
Yeah, it's kind of relates to the previous my previous reply, that if you think about it, depends on quite much on what your technology education looks like in the country where you're, what your curriculum emphasizes, so to speak. But most curricula emphasize the design process. I think there's some potential degree of determinism there also in how you design. You talk about design fixation, for instance, where you can get stuck in a certain mindset when you design. That's some kind of determinism on that micro level, but also you have that macro level that I talked about just recently in terms of the societal level, so to speak, where some curricula also emphasize the role of technology in society. And there it's also important for a technology educator to have that, to be able to see those kinds of deterministic potentialities that there are, and also how you can act not to let technology steer your life, but vice versa. That it's important, I think, to instill in students that they can make choices to decide on how we should develop technology in the future, not the least in relation to sustainable development and such issues of the environment.
Awesome, thank you.
Casterfield mentions this, but technological determinism has sort of like both weaker and stronger forms amongst advocates of that as a theory. You sort of try to find a different way of conceptualizing that, and conceptualizing the question of technological determinism by something you've mentioned a few times in your last couple answers, which is the concept of deterministic potentialities. I was wondering if you could just explain a bit more in detail what you mean by deterministic potentialities, and what problems you think thinking about it that way actually solves.
Yeah. I think I don't use the same concepts as Kaiserfeld. I think that's quite a good way of describing it also as weaker and stronger forms of determinism. And what I think we should be aware of is the stronger forms of determinism, but I call it deterministic potentialities, where you can situations where you can see that you might get stuck in old ways of thinking or old ways of doing technology. So that's kind of the micro level that I talked about in the design process. In the design process, you want to be creative and think up the most creative solution, and it's important then not to let previous solutions determine how you develop the new solutions. So there you have some kind of determinism potentially, but also at the societal level also that we talked about, when you have and there it's maybe more appropriate to talk about systems, large infrastructural systems that are hard to change. So there you have some kind of determinism in the sense that they are not so easy to change, but you have to the cost of changing them is quite great, and so it's important to be wary of those potentialities also, to be able to take from a citizen point of view, to take the right decisions for the future. for instance, in terms of sustainable development.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that, particularly the difference between thinking about individual technologies and technological systems? Because I think a lot of the time we will think about like a computer as the technology as opposed to like the system in which it is part of or embedded in. Can you talk a bit about how we should think about the difference between the sorts of systems versus individual technologies?
Yeah. I think there's, if you read the literature, both philosophers and historians, they would most often say that systems include some degree of determinism since they're so complex, especially hybrid systems that include technical components, natural components, social components. They also get more difficult to change. So there's some degree of determinism there. The economists, they call it path dependence, that you tend to follow the path in the forest that's already marked out, so to speak, instead of just wandering around in the forest. And that's maybe a metaphor that's good to have in mind when you think about determinism, that previous choices, especially concerning technological systems, also tend to determine and narrow down the choices that we can make in the future.
You write that design happens in the space between what is socially desirable and the technologically possible. Could you elaborate on what you mean by this?
Yes, that's also based on the research in the philosophy of technology, but it's when you design something, you have an idea what you want to design, but it's also constrained by material, previous technologies, the level of technological development at a particular time. You can't actually design anything. There are constraints on what you can design. And there, that's where I talk about some deterministic potentialities. And I mentioned, for instance, modeling design fixation as both material and sort of discursive constraints or potentialities for determinism in the design situation. But what I want to get at is the fact that when you're designing, it can be in school, but it can also be in a design studio or in industry or anywhere. You can't think up just anything. You're constrained by different, by the current knowledge in the natural sciences, by the current state of the art of this particular engineering or technological area that you're in, and also you're also kind of constrained by choices that others have made before you. So that means that it's the eventual design will be a combination, or it will end up somewhere in between what is technically possible and what is socially desirable. That's where there can be determinism.
So building upon that, how can or should technology educators bring questions of philosophy and history into the classroom?
Yeah, that's a good point. A good question. There are a multitude of ways, I think. Some of them relate to what we've been talking about determinism, looking at the societal view and the micro view when designing. But it could also be in the philosophy of technology, there are basically roughly two different schools. It's a critical school and it's an analytical school. And you can, in the analytical philosophy of technology, it deals a lot with shaping or making concepts clearer. It's to a great extent a conceptual science. So in the analytical philosophy of technology, it could help pinpointing concepts for technology education and also sharpening these concepts so that they become clearer and it's easier to know what you mean when you talk about design or technology or some related concept. But the critical philosophy has to do more with ethics and in that sense a bit broader. It has to do with the relationship between technology and society and nature, issues of sustainability and so on from an ethical point of view. So those critical perspectives on technology are also very important from a citizenship point of view, I think.
Yeah, so pivoting a bit to some of your other work, so one of the problems with sort of stronger forms of technological determinism is that it takes something that's often like very messy and very contingent, which is sort of like historical events and developments, and it tries to kind of give like a monocausal explanation. It says like,
Yeah.
technology is the driver of that. And your own historical work, particularly on wastewater and drinking water systems, tries to provide, I think, a more nuanced and complicated explanation for why specific technologies and specific technological systems are adopted or rejected in a specific time and a specific place. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about what factors actually contribute to the adoption or the rejection of specific technologies.
Yeah, I think that's a question that you have to answer at the end of the day empirically to look at different technologies. But since you ask about water and sewer systems, which I have studied a lot, I can say that there's been, since you could say that they are kind of technical health systems or envirotechnical systems, you can call them also. And they've been introduced to solve environmental and health problems in the cities, starting out in the early to mid 19th century in Britain, the USA, Northern Europe, etc. And that gives them, it's easy to connect them to what happened afterwards, namely that the mortality and most of all the mortality rates really decreased a lot in the late 19th century. And it's in earlier historical research, it's connected this very much to the introduction of water and sewer systems in the cities. And it's partly correct, but it's not a good way of answering the question of why these systems were introduced and why you pick out one technology instead of another one. If you take water supply, for instance, there were also many other actors in the cities, like engineers, politicians, were concerned with, and it was above all the fire protection question, especially in the Nordic countries with a lot of wooden buildings in the cities. Fire was an eminent danger through history, and also the buildings, the houses and buildings were also built very close to each other and so on. So they needed some kind of effective fire protection system, and what better fire protection system than a water supply system with like a water tower or something, so you can put pressure on the water. So that was actually a big argument in Sweden, and I know also in the USA in certain places. But you also had the health argument, of course. In a Swedish city of Norrköping, you had a very quite unique argument. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else, but they introduced piped water supply to make the workers healthy enough to be able to work in the factories, but also so that you could use the river in that city as a kind of a sewer for the industrial waste in the city. So they took the healthy water upstream, and so they could continue to use the river in the city in the actual city as a sewer. So it was not only health arguments, but also fire protection arguments, and also industrial development arguments, so that industry could be developed. And as regards sewerage, it wasn't only health arguments either that were dominating, but it was also had to do with draining swampy land so that you could build factories or houses or whatever, so that the city could develop. So there were many different kinds of arguments that were viable when they introduced these systems. So as you say, it's history is seldom explained by just one factor. There are many factors, and this goes also for many other technological systems and technologies when they were introduced, that there were many different arguments. But then, in a sense, you can say that there was some determinism here, that for a long time people were thinking that since the mortality rates went down, it must be that the systems were introduced to reduce mortality. But it was only one of many factors and arguments that led to the introduction of piped water supply and sewerage.
We're running a little short on time now, so we're going to jump to a YouTube question from one of our commenters. Jesse Hogan writes, what developments and advancements in technology make the future of education more accessible to all students?
Oh, that's that's a big question. I think that what we've seen during COVID-19 with a lot of distance education on Zoom, like this interview, we've done some really big steps forward in that regard. But I also think that we've also established, I think, in a lot of research, that students miss the social dimensions of teaching. So I think some kind of hybrid technologies, both to facilitate long distance education, and that you could also meet up in person and have classmates and get kind of the social dimension of teaching and the social dimension of being a student. I think that would be really a big innovation, to find some good hybrid teaching systems in that regard. But I can't give any good examples right now, but I think that's what I would say as an answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that brings it full circle to what we were talking about with technological determinism, which is Zoom existed for quite a while prior to the pandemic, but it required a big social desire to actually use it in the case of a response to a pandemic. So it wasn't simply the existence of the technology that pushed all of these things online, it was the existence of the technology meeting a social need. So I think that's actually a great example of that innovation happening in that space between technology and social need. And I think that's a great place to end it. I don't know if you have any final comments that you'd like to leave us with before we depart, or?
The only thing I want to say, I think that's also what I write at the very end of my paper, is that the idea of technological determinism may be in itself dangerous if we don't critically examine that, because it might mean that we leave the decisions about technology to either to experts or to the technology itself, instead of realizing that we as humans are the ones who actually decide on what we should do with technology.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
We've been joined by Jonas Hallström, and so thanks so much, Jonas, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was very interesting. Have a good day.